Where is your wife? Somewhere in the kitchen, cleaning floor.
It's fine. You deserve this.
Ladies and gentlemen, after 10 years of marriage, I've learned something important. If Sophia thinks something is a disaster,
It usually means everything is perfectly fine.
Stop. Don't do this. I adore wrong man throughout my entire marriage life.
I am tired of seeing your face. Stop saying those words you don't even know about.
I live with the wrong person. He doesn't love me. And now I don't care.
3 months later, people in New York still talked about the same night. Not because the orchestra stopped playing. Not because a billionaire lost his temper. Not even because one of the city's most admired businessmen publicly humiliated his wife in front of hundreds of guests. They remembered that night because of what happened afterward. Because the woman everyone expected to disappear did something no one anticipated. She walked away, and she never looked back. Sophia Bennett had spent 10 years helping other people shine. She was the woman behind successful meetings, profitable partnerships, and flawless public appearances. She remembered details nobody else noticed. She knew which investors cared about numbers and which cared about reputation. She could sit through a 2-hour conversation and understand exactly what people were hiding. But very few people knew any of that. To most of Manhattan's elite, she was simply Daniel Carter's wife. Nothing more, nothing less. And that suited Daniel perfectly. For years, he enjoyed receiving credit for ideas that were not entirely his. Sophia never demanded recognition. She never fought for attention. She never interrupted him during meetings to remind everyone whose strategy they were actually discussing. She believed marriage was a partnership. She believed success shared was success multiplied. Unfortunately, Daniel believed something different. He believed success belonged to whoever stood closest to the microphone. The Carter Foundation Gala was supposed to be the biggest event of the year. The ballroom glittered beneath crystal chandeliers. Politicians mingled with celebrities. Magazine photographers moved through the crowd searching for perfect images. Champagne flowed. Music floated through the air. Everything looked expensive. Everything looked perfect. And Daniel loved perfect appearances. Standing beside him in an elegant midnight blue gown, Sophia looked calm as always. The sapphire earrings she wore had belonged to her grandmother. She touched them whenever she needed to think clearly. Tonight she touched them often, because she knew something was wrong. Earlier that afternoon, she had reviewed Daniel's keynote speech. One figure immediately caught her attention. A major investment number. It was incorrect. Not slightly incorrect. Dangerously incorrect. If he repeated it publicly, several investors would notice. And they would ask questions. Questions Daniel would struggle to answer. She had warned him twice. But Daniel barely listened. Lately, he had begun treating advice as criticism, correction as disrespect, reality as inconvenience. An hour into the gala, Daniel stepped onto the stage. The applause was immediate. He smiled, adjusted his cufflinks, and began speaking. Everything went smoothly for the first few minutes. Then he reached the investment figures. Sophia felt her stomach tighten. There it was, the wrong number. Exactly as she feared. Several executives exchanged glances. One investor quietly raised an eyebrow. Sophia moved closer to the stage. She didn't want to embarrass him. She wanted to save him. In a low voice, she said, "Daniel, you need to correct that. Simple, private, respectful. The kind of thing a supportive spouse would say." Unfortunately, pride was already speaking louder than reason. Daniel turned toward her. The microphone was still on, and before he thought better of it, he laughed. Not a warm laugh, not a playful laugh, a cruel one, the kind designed to make someone feel small. Here we go again, he said. The room grew quieter. Sophia froze. Daniel continued. My wife thinks she runs every meeting she walks into. A few nervous guests laughed, most didn't. He should have stopped there. Instead, he kept going. Maybe one day she'll understand that reading my notes doesn't make her the CEO. The silence became heavier. Sophia felt hundreds of eyes on her, but she refused to look down. She refused to give anyone the satisfaction. Then came the moment everyone would remember. Daniel lifted his champagne glass, made a careless gesture, and the drink spilled across the front of her gown. Cold liquid soaked the blue silk. The room gasped. Whether it was an accident or not hardly mattered anymore. The contempt behind it was impossible to miss. For a second, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the musicians stopped playing. Sophia looked down at the stain. Then she slowly lifted her eyes to meet her husband's. There were no tears, no pleading, no anger. Only disappointment, deep, quiet, final, and somehow that expression hurt more than any public argument ever could. Then a voice broke the silence. Interesting. Every head turned. At the front table sat Alexander Hayes, the billionaire founder of Hayes Global Holdings, one of the most influential businessmen in the country, a man famous for speaking only when necessary. He rose from his chair. The room instinctively made space. Alexander looked at Daniel, then at Sophia, and then he said something nobody would forget. Tell me, Daniel. His voice was calm. How much of your success disappears when she leaves? The ballroom went silent. Completely silent. Daniel's smile vanished. Sophia blinked. Alexander continued. Because I've spent the last 5 years watching meetings. He folded his hands. And every time the smartest idea enters the room, his gaze settled on Sophia. It usually comes from her. No one laughed now. Truth had arrived, and truth was far more powerful than humiliation. Sophia did not defend herself. She did not thank Alexander. She did not argue. She simply picked up her clutch, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward the exit. Every step echoed across the silent ballroom. No rush, no drama, no tears, just dignity, the kind that cannot be bought, the kind that survives when everything else falls apart. Behind her, Daniel stood frozen. For the first time in years, he looked uncertain. For the first time in years, he looked alone. And somewhere deep inside, Sophia finally understood something she should have realized long ago. The marriage had ended long before this night. This was simply the first time everyone else noticed. The next morning, New York woke up hungry for answers. Before sunrise, short clips from the gala had already spread through private groups, business circles, and social media accounts. By breakfast, thousands of people had watched Daniel Carter publicly embarrass his wife. By lunch, everyone had an opinion. Some called it arrogance. Others called it a misunderstanding. Daniel's public relations team worked frantically, releasing statements about stress, pressure, and unfortunate timing. They insisted the champagne spill had been accidental and that the media was exaggerating the situation. But no statement could erase what people had seen with their own eyes. More importantly, no statement could explain Alexander Hayes' words. Across the city, people kept asking the same question. How much of Daniel's success actually belonged to Sophia? Sophia ignored every headline. She turned off her phone and moved into a small apartment overlooking the Hudson River. It wasn't luxurious compared to the mansion she had shared with Daniel, but it felt peaceful. For the first time in years, silence belonged to her. There were no emergency calls from assistants, no late-night requests to review presentations, no constant pressure to make someone else appear brilliant. Every morning she sat near the window with a notebook and a cup of coffee. She wrote whatever came to mind. Sometimes memories, sometimes regrets, sometimes plans. One morning she wrote a single sentence that remained on the page for nearly an hour. I spent 10 years building a throne for someone who never respected the hands that built it. The truth hurt, but it also felt strangely freeing. Meanwhile, Daniel was discovering how difficult life became when hidden support disappeared. At first, he assumed the scandal would pass. He believed people would eventually forget and return to admiring him. After all, they always had before. But something had changed. Investors who once accepted his explanations without question began asking for detailed reports. Board members wanted clearer strategies. Business partners requested documentation and implementation plans. For years, Daniel had relied on Sophia to refine his ideas, identify weaknesses, and solve problems before they became visible. Without her, meetings suddenly felt different. Questions that once seemed easy now felt dangerous. Discussions he used to dominate became uncomfortable. He found himself speaking with confidence but lacking substance. The difference was subtle at first, but people noticed. 3 weeks after the gala, Daniel attended an important meeting with international investors. It should have been routine. Instead, it became a disaster. During a presentation, one investor challenged his growth projections. Another questioned the logic behind a major expansion plan. Daniel attempted to answer, but his explanations lacked depth. Within minutes, confidence turned into uncertainty. By the end of the meeting, 2 investors postponed their commitments. One withdrew completely. As the conference room emptied, Daniel sat alone staring at the screen. For the first time, he couldn't blame anyone else. Deep down, he knew exactly what was happening. The woman who had quietly protected him for years was gone. Across town, Sophia's life was moving in a very different direction. One afternoon, she received a call from Alexander Hayes. He invited her to lunch at a quiet restaurant overlooking Central Park. She almost declined. The last thing she wanted was attention. But something about his voice felt sincere. When she arrived, Alexander was already waiting. There were no reporters, no assistants, no photographers. Just 2 cups of coffee and a simple leather folder resting on the table. After a few minutes of conversation, he slid the folder toward her. "I want you to see something," he said. Sophia opened it. Inside were dozens of documents. Strategic plans, investment proposals, partnership frameworks, business models. She recognized every page immediately. They were hers, her ideas, her analyses, her solutions. Years of work, years of thinking, years of contributions, all carrying someone else's name. For several moments, she simply stared at the papers. There was something painful about seeing your intelligence dressed in another person's identity. Alexander watched her carefully before speaking again. "Do you know why I invited you here?" he asked. Sophia closed the folder. "No, because I've spent years studying successful people." She remained silent. "And I've learned something important." "What?" "The person receiving credit is not always the person creating value." Sophia looked at him. Alexander leaned back in his chair. "Daniel impressed people. You built things." The sentence hit harder than she expected, not because it was flattering, because it was accurate. For years, she had lived in the shadow of someone else's reputation. She had convinced herself that partnership mattered more than recognition. She had accepted being invisible because she believed the work itself was enough. But sitting there across from Alexander Hayes, she realized how much of herself she had given away. Alexander opened another folder. "This company needs rebuilding," he said. "Not financially, structurally, ethically, intellectually." Sophia listened. "I don't need another executive." "What do you need?" He smiled slightly. "I need the person who should have been leading in the first place." The words hung between them. Outside the restaurant window, people moved through the park, unaware that Sophia's future was changing. She didn't answer. Immediately. For years she had been hidden. For years she had worked behind curtains while others stood in the spotlight. Part of her wanted to walk away from the business world entirely. But another part remembered every talented entrepreneur she had met. Every brilliant founder ignored because they lacked connections. Every woman whose ideas had been dismissed until a man repeated them. Every hardworking person denied opportunities because powerful rooms preferred familiar faces. Maybe the problem wasn't business itself. Maybe the problem was who controlled it. "What exactly are you offering?" she finally asked. Alexander smiled. And for the next 2 hours, they discussed a vision that would eventually change thousands of lives. A vision built not on image, not on ego, not on appearances, but on opportunity. For the first time in many years, Sophia felt something she had almost forgotten: excitement. And somewhere across the city, Daniel Carter had no idea that the woman he underestimated was about to build something far greater than anything he had ever achieved alone. The following months changed everything. What began as a private lunch between Sophia Bennett and Alexander Hayes slowly evolved into one of the most talked about projects in the business world. Unlike most corporate initiatives, their vision was not built around publicity. It was built around results. Sophia insisted on that from the very beginning. She had spent too many years watching wealthy organizations spend more money on marketing their generosity than actually helping people. If she was going to put her name on something, it would have to matter. The new organization was called the Horizon Initiative. Its purpose was simple: identify talented people who lacked access to powerful networks and provide them with the resources, mentorship, and funding necessary to succeed. Sophia wanted the application process to be straightforward. She didn't want brilliant people rejected simply because they couldn't afford professional consultants or polished presentations. She wanted ideas to matter more than appearance. Alexander agreed immediately. It was one of the many reasons their partnership worked so well. Neither of them cared much about applause. They cared about outcomes. As news of the initiative spread, applications began arriving from every corner of the country. Small business owners, teachers, engineers, inventors, healthcare workers, and young entrepreneurs submitted proposals. Sophia reviewed them personally. Day after day, she sat at her desk reading stories that reminded her exactly why the project mattered. She discovered a single mother who had created an affordable tutoring platform for underprivileged students. She found an engineer developing low-cost water purification systems for rural communities. She met a young woman designing software to help small businesses manage their finances. Many applicants lacked polished language. Some made grammar mistakes. Others struggled to explain their ideas clearly. But Sophia had spent years learning how to see potential beneath presentation. She knew that brilliance often arrived wearing ordinary clothes. One evening, after reviewing applications for nearly 6 hours, she received an unexpected visitor. When she opened her apartment door, she was surprised to find Eleanor Carter standing outside, Daniel's mother. For a moment, neither woman spoke. The last time they had shared a room, Eleanor had treated Sophia more like an accessory than a daughter-in-law. Throughout the marriage, she had consistently sided with her son. She admired wealth, status, and confidence. Unfortunately, she often confused confidence with character. Now she looked different, older somehow. Tired, less certain. "May I come in?" Eleanor asked quietly. Sophia hesitated only briefly before stepping aside. A few minutes later, they sat across from each other with tea resting between them. The silence felt uncomfortable at first. Neither woman seemed eager to begin. Eventually, Eleanor looked around the apartment and smiled faintly. "It feels peaceful here. It is." Eleanor nodded. For several moments, she stared into her cup before finally speaking. "I owe you an apology." Sophia said nothing. "I spent years misunderstanding you." The older woman exhaled, slowly. "I thought quiet people were weak." Still, Sophia remained silent. "I thought because Daniel spoke louder, he was smarter." The words seemed difficult for her to say. "I thought because you never demanded attention, you didn't deserve it." For the first time, Sophia looked directly into her eyes. Eleanor lowered her gaze. "I was wrong." No excuses followed. No attempts to justify her behavior, just honesty. And somehow that made the apology feel real. Sophia could see genuine regret in the woman's face. Years ago, she might have felt satisfaction hearing those words. Now she felt something. Different acceptance. The past could not be changed, but people could. "Why are you here?" Sophia asked softly. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the cup. "Because I've spent months watching my son lose things he spent years taking for granted." Sophia remained quiet. "And because I finally understand something." "What?" Eleanor looked up. "Daniel thought your loyalty was permanent." The room fell silent. He never imagined life without it. Sophia glanced toward the window. Outside, evening lights reflected against the river. After a long pause, she finally answered, "Neither did I." Eleanor nodded sadly. Before leaving, she reached into her handbag and removed a small velvet box. It belonged to my grandmother, she said. You don't have to. I know. She placed it gently on the table. Keep it anyway. After she left, Sophia opened the box. Inside rested a delicate gold compass pendant. On the back were engraved 4 simple words: find your own direction. Sophia stared at the inscription for a long time. Then she smiled. For the first time in months, the weight inside her chest felt lighter. Meanwhile, Daniel's situation continued to deteriorate. The decline wasn't dramatic. There were no public scandals, no explosive confrontations, just a steady erosion of confidence. Partnerships stalled. Investors became cautious. Clients requested more oversight. The admiration he once enjoyed began disappearing. People still respected his accomplishments, but respect and trust were not the same thing. One afternoon, while reviewing disappointing financial reports, Daniel received news that shook him. The Horizon Initiative had secured record-breaking support from donors. Major business leaders were joining its advisory. Board applications had surpassed all expectations, and Sophia Bennett had become the face of the entire movement. Daniel stared at the article on his screen. A photograph showed Sophia speaking during a planning meeting. She looked confident, focused, alive. For several moments, he simply stared. Then, he noticed something unexpected. The success didn't surprise him. The truth was far worse. Deep down, he had always known she was capable of it. He had simply convinced himself that she would never leave. Across the city, preparations for the Horizon Initiative's official launch were nearly complete. The event would bring together investors, community leaders, journalists, and the first group of selected entrepreneurs. Everyone expected it to be successful. Nobody realized it was about to become something much bigger. Because for the first time in her life, Sophia Bennett was stepping into the spotlight under her own name, not as someone's wife, not as someone's advisor, not as the invisible architect behind another person's success, but as herself. And once the world finally saw what she was capable of, there would be no returning to the shadows. The night of the Horizon Initiative's official launch arrived beneath a sky painted with gold and silver clouds. The restored Civic Center in downtown Manhattan glowed with warmth. Unlike the luxury hotels where business elites usually gathered, this place felt different. The walls carried history. The atmosphere felt welcoming rather than intimidating. Young musicians performed near the entrance while guests filled the hall with quiet excitement. Entrepreneurs sat beside investors. Teachers shared tables with executives. Community leaders exchanged conversations with technology founders. It was exactly the kind of room Sophia had envisioned from the beginning. A room where people mattered more than titles. Backstage, Sophia stood alone for a few moments reviewing her notes. Through the curtains, she could hear hundreds of conversations blending together. Reporters had arrived early. Several major publications were covering the event. Investors who normally ignored community-focused projects had made personal appearances. The attention was far greater than anyone expected. Her assistant Maya entered carrying the final guest list. "Everything is ready," she said. Sophia smiled. "Good." Maya hesitated. "There is one thing." Sophia looked up. "What is it?" She handed over the list. Sophia scanned it quickly before her eyes stopped on a familiar name. Daniel Carter. For a few seconds, she said nothing. Maya watched her carefully. "Do you want security to stop him?" Sophia studied the name. Months ago, the thought of seeing him again might have unsettled her. Now she felt nothing but calm. Finally, she handed the list back. "No." Maya looked surprised. "Are you sure?" Sophia nodded. "This event isn't about fear." The answer ended the conversation. As Maya left, Sophia glanced at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed different from the person who had walked out of the gala months earlier. Not harder, not colder, simply stronger. There was a difference. Strength built from pain often carried wisdom with it. And Sophia had learned many things. The most important was that self-worth could not depend on someone else's ability to recognize it. At 7 o'clock, the event officially began. The hall was full. Every seat occupied. Dozens of selected entrepreneurs sat near the front rows. Many had never attended an event like this before. Some looked nervous, others looked excited, several appeared overwhelmed. Sophia loved that, because tonight belonged to them. Not to celebrities, not to politicians, not to wealthy donors seeking attention, to builders, dreamers, people who had continued moving forward despite being overlooked. Alexander Hayes opened the evening with a brief speech. As always, he wasted no words. For years, he began, we have mistaken visibility for value. We have rewarded people for being seen instead of rewarding them for building things that matter. Tonight is our attempt to correct that mistake. The audience applauded. Alexander waited for silence before continuing. Many of the people sitting in this room have spent years being underestimated. Not because they lacked talent, not because they lacked discipline, simply because the wrong people controlled the doors. His gaze moved across the audience. That changes tonight. The applause grew louder. Then Alexander smiled slightly. And there is one person who deserves credit for making this vision real. The audience already knew who he meant. Sophia heard her name announced. A wave of applause filled the hall. Then it grew louder. And louder. People rose from their seats, one after another, until the entire room was standing. Sophia froze for a moment. She had not expected this. Standing ovations were common for celebrities, not for people who spent most of their lives working quietly behind the scenes. For several seconds, she simply stood there, looking across hundreds of faces, faces filled with respect. Not pity, not sympathy, respect. The distinction mattered. Slowly, she walked onto the stage. The applause continued. Near the back of the room, Daniel Carter watched silently. For the first time since their separation, he saw something clearly. The admiration filling the room had nothing to do with him. It had never belonged to him. The audience eventually settled. Sophia stepped behind the podium. The hall became silent. For a moment, she simply looked around. Then she began speaking. Thank you for being here. Her voice was calm, steady, confident. Not loud. It didn't need to be. For many years, I watched extraordinary people struggle to find opportunities they had already earned. I watched talent get ignored because it lacked connections. I watched brilliant ideas die because nobody powerful was willing to listen. The audience listened carefully. She continued. I met teachers changing lives with almost no resources. Entrepreneurs creating jobs while being denied funding. Innovators solving problems nobody else wanted to solve. Several entrepreneurs in the front rows nodded. They understood exactly what she meant. The problem was never a lack of talent. Sophia paused. The problem was access. The room remained silent. Every word landed. Too many doors were controlled by people who only recognized value when it looked familiar. Several guests exchanged thoughtful glances, because they knew she was right. Sophia looked across the audience. Then she smiled. Tonight is not about proving anyone wrong. That sentence surprised many people, because they knew her story. They knew what had happened at the gala. They knew how she had been treated, yet she wasn't talking about revenge. She wasn't talking about humiliation. She wasn't talking about the people who had underestimated her. Instead, she said something nobody expected. Tonight is about making sure the next talented person doesn't have to wait as long as I did. The hall became completely still. Even the reporters stopped typing. Some truths demanded silence. Sophia continued speaking for another 15 minutes. She spoke about opportunity, responsibility, leadership, service. She spoke about creating systems that outlived individual success, about building structures that helped others rise, about opening doors instead of guarding them. And not once did she mention Daniel. Not once did she mention the gala. Not once did she center herself. That was exactly why the speech felt powerful. When she finally finished, the applause lasted nearly a full minute. Several people wiped away tears. Others simply stood quietly absorbing what they had heard. Then came the most important part of the evening, the announcement of the first selected entrepreneurs. One by one, names were called. A young engineer creating affordable medical devices, a former teacher building an educational platform, a mother of three launching a community healthcare network, a software developer helping small businesses survive, a nonprofit founder supporting homeless veterans. Each received funding, mentorship, and long-term support. When one woman heard her name announced, she burst into tears before reaching the stage. The audience immediately rose to their feet. Sophia embraced her. The woman whispered something into her ear. What did she say? A reporter later asked. Sophia smiled. She said someone finally believed her. By the end of the evening, the room felt transformed. People weren't talking about scandals. They weren't discussing gossip. They weren't even focused on Sophia anymore. They were talking about possibilities, which was exactly what she wanted. Near the back of the hall, Daniel sat alone, watching, listening, thinking, and for the first time in his life, he understood what real leadership looked like. It wasn't dominance, it wasn't attention, it wasn't applause, it was service. And the woman he once dismissed possessed more of it than he ever had. As the crowd began dispersing, Daniel remained seated, because deep inside he knew something painful. The world had finally seen Sophia Bennett clearly, and now everyone understood what he had lost. Long after the guests had gone home and the cameras had stopped recording, Sophia remained inside the hall. Workers were folding chairs, technicians were disconnecting lights, volunteers were gathering materials from the event. The excitement of the evening had begun fading into quiet satisfaction. Sophia stood near one of the large windows overlooking the city. The lights of Manhattan stretched endlessly into the distance. Thousands of windows glowed against the night sky, each one holding a different story. For several moments, she simply stood there, breathing, thinking, remembering. A year ago, she had believed her life was already written. She thought she understood her future. She imagined herself continuing exactly as she always had, standing beside someone else's success while slowly disappearing from her own story. Now everything was different, not because she had planned it, not because she had fought for it, because life had finally forced her to see what she had been refusing to acknowledge. Some endings arrive disguised as disasters, and some humiliations become the beginning of freedom. Quite a night. Sophia turned. Alexander Hayes was walking toward her holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to her. She smiled. Thank you. For a moment they stood side by side, looking out over the city. The applications doubled tonight, Alexander said. Sophia laughed softly. I'm not surprised. The donors want to expand nationally. She looked at him. Already? They're serious. Sophia shook her head. A year earlier, nobody would have believed any of this. Alexander studied her for a moment. Do you regret any of it? The question surprised her. What exactly? The marriage. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. Sophia thought carefully before answering. Finally, she spoke. I regret how long I stayed invisible. Alexander nodded. That answer seemed to tell him everything. Because the truth wasn't that Daniel had destroyed her confidence. The truth was more complicated. For years she had helped him do it. Not intentionally, not knowingly, but every time she accepted less than she deserved, every time she remained silent when her work was taken, every time she convinced herself that recognition didn't matter, she had participated in her own disappearance. The realization had been painful, but it had also been necessary. Growth often was. A few minutes later, they left the building together. Outside, the night air felt cool and fresh. The city seemed alive with possibility. For the first time in years, Sophia wasn't worried about tomorrow. She was excited for it. The months that followed exceeded every expectation. The Horizon Initiative expanded rapidly. Dozens of businesses received support. New jobs were created. Communities benefited. Investors who once ignored small entrepreneurs began paying attention. Success stories multiplied. One young engineer secured a major manufacturing contract. A former teacher expanded her educational platform into 3 states. A healthcare startup funded through the initiative began serving thousands of families. Every victory reinforced the same lesson. Talent had never been scarce. Opportunity had been, and now Sophia was helping change that. As her influence grew, invitations arrived from everywhere. Universities asked her to speak. Business conferences requested interviews. National organizations offered partnerships. Unlike Daniel, she never chased attention. Ironically, that made people respect her even more, because authenticity was rare, and people recognized it when they saw it. Meanwhile, Daniel's world continued shrinking. His company survived, but it was no longer thriving. Several key partnerships were lost. Revenue declined. His reputation never fully recovered. People remained polite, professional, respectful, but something fundamental had changed. The admiration was gone. And without admiration, Daniel was forced to confront himself honestly for the first time. One evening, he sat alone in his office staring at a framed magazine cover from years earlier. It featured his photograph, a confident smile, a headline calling him a visionary leader. For a long time, he looked at it. Then he quietly removed the frame from the wall, because he finally understood something. The image had never been the problem. The illusion behind it was. For years, he had mistaken borrowed brilliance for personal greatness, and now there was nobody left to hide that truth from him. Nearly 18 months after the gala, Sophia received an invitation to speak at one of the largest leadership conferences in the country. More than 5,000 people attended. Business leaders, students, entrepreneurs, investors, community organizers, people from every background imaginable. As she stepped onto the stage, applause filled the auditorium. She smiled and thanked the audience. Then she began speaking. During the question and answer session, a young woman stood up near the back. She looked nervous. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the microphone. "How do you recover?" she asked. "After someone makes you feel small?" The room became quiet. Sophia looked at her for a moment, then she smiled gently. Most people ask the wrong question. The audience listened. They ask how to recover after being underestimated. She paused. The better question is why you believed their opinion mattered more than your truth. The young woman blinked. Sophia continued. When someone fails to see your value, that doesn't automatically reduce it. The auditorium remained silent. Sometimes people overlook you because they are distracted. She paused. Sometimes because they are insecure. Another pause. And sometimes because recognizing your value would force them to question their own. The audience nodded. Many were writing notes. Sophia smiled again. The important thing is this. She looked directly at the young woman. Never measure your worth using someone else's blindness. For a second, the room was completely still. Then applause erupted. Louder than before. Stronger than before. Not because the words were dramatic, because they were true. That night, after returning home, Sophia sat on the balcony of her apartment overlooking the river. The city lights reflected across the water. A soft breeze moved through the air. Beside her rested a small wooden box. Inside was the gold compass Eleanor had given her. She opened it and smiled. Find your own direction. For a long time she stared at those words. Then she thought about everything that had happened. The gala, the humiliation, the heartbreak, the loneliness, the rebuilding, the success, the people whose lives had changed, the future still waiting ahead. And suddenly, she understood something. Her greatest victory had never been proving Daniel wrong. It had never been becoming successful. It had never been public recognition. Her greatest victory was much simpler. She no longer needed permission to believe in herself. The woman who walked out of that ballroom had been wounded. The woman sitting on that balcony was free. And that made all the difference. Because the most powerful comeback isn't the one that destroys the people who hurt you. It's the one that makes their actions irrelevant. It's the one that transforms pain into purpose, loss into wisdom, silence into strength. It is the moment you stop asking the world to recognize your value and start living as if it already exists. Years later, people would still tell the story of Sophia Bennett. Some remembered the gala. Some remembered the scandal. Some remembered the speech that changed thousands of lives. But the people who truly understood her story remembered something else. They remembered a woman who finally stopped shrinking herself to make someone else feel important. A woman who chose purpose over bitterness, growth over revenge, truth over appearance. And because of that choice, she built a life far greater than the one she lost.